The night air was thick with the hum of the city, a soft buzz that seemed to hum under the flickering streetlights. LeBron James, his face still glistening from the game, walked down the sidewalk, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. It was a familiar route home, a path he had walked 1,000 times before. The city's pulse surrounded him, the sound of distant laughter, the low rumble of car engines, the occasional shuffling of feet. He just finished a game, a victory that should have brought the usual excitement, but tonight, something felt different. He slowed as he passed a small, dimly lit corner, just off the main street. There, sitting hunched over on a piece of cardboard, was an older man, his clothes torn, his face hidden in shadow. The man muttered to himself, his eyes vacant, far away, as if he were talking to someone unseen. LeBron had seen his fair share of homeless people before, but this man's presence made something in him stir, a curiosity, an unease, an unfamiliar pull that he couldn't ignore. LeBron stopped a few steps away, unsure of what to do. The man's eyes shifted toward him. They locked for a moment, hard, unreadable. The man blinked slowly, as if trying to process the sight of LeBron in front of him. LeBron felt the weight of that gaze, but his feet moved forward. He didn't know why, but something told him to sit down. "Hey," LeBron said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You doing okay, man?" The man's lips barely moved, a rough grunt the only reply. His beard was long and unkempt, his hair tangled and wild. His clothes were layered in old jackets and pants, the colors faded beyond recognition. He smelled of stale cigarettes and something heavier, something that seemed to seep from his very soul. LeBron, despite the unease swirling in his stomach, sat down on the edge of the curb beside him. There was silence for a few moments, just the distant noise of the world going on without them. The veteran didn't speak. "I'm LeBron," LeBron said, offering a hand. The man didn't take it, his hands curled tightly in his lap. "What's your name?" The man stared at him for a long time, eyes flicking back and forth between LeBron's face and the ground. Finally, he muttered, "Barron." His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "John Barron." LeBron nodded, trying to smile, but it felt awkward. He glanced around. The street was quiet now, save for the occasional honk of a distant car. There were no other people in sight, no one to witness this strange meeting between a superstar and a broken man. John Barron's eyes shifted again, this time glancing at the crumpled paper bag by his side. LeBron noticed the shaking of his hands, the way they held onto the bag like it might vanish if he let go. "You need anything?" LeBron asked, his words falling into the space between them. John's gaze flickered for a moment, his eyes narrowing, scanning LeBron. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "I don't need money. I don't need that." LeBron hesitated, unsure of what to say next. "Then what do you need?" John's eyes met his again, this time with something different, something raw, something desperate. He didn't say a word, but his lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. After a long, tense silence, John finally muttered, "I need someone to listen." LeBron sat still, absorbing those words. He didn't have the answers, didn't know how to fix what was broken in front of him. But in that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't walk away. He looked at John Barron, his voice calm but steady. "I'm here." And for the first time in what felt like years, John didn't pull away. Instead, he simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, and the silence that followed was somehow not empty. It was the beginning of something unspoken, something that neither of them yet understood. The next day, LeBron returned to the same corner, his footsteps a little slower, a little more deliberate. It had been a restless night for him, the echoes of their brief conversation still ringing in his ears. He wasn't sure why he felt so drawn to this man, why his presence lingered with him long after he had left. As he turned the corner, he saw John Barron again, sitting in the same spot, his back against the brick wall. LeBron walked over, and without a word, sat down beside him. The street around them was still waking up, people beginning their day, their voices blending into the city's rhythm. John barely acknowledged his presence, his eyes fixed ahead, watching the world move without him. LeBron waited. He wasn't in a rush. Finally, after a few minutes, John spoke. His voice was rough, strained, like he hadn't used it in years. "I was there," he said suddenly, his words as sharp as glass. "In the war." LeBron's head turned slightly toward him. "Where?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the street, as if he were watching something that only he could see. "Vietnam," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I was just a kid. Thought I was doing something good. Fighting for freedom. But when we got there, it was all wrong. It didn't feel right." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy. LeBron sat in silence, not pushing, not probing. He let John speak when he was ready. John's fingers gripped the cardboard tightly, his knuckles white. "We were in the jungle and I don't remember much of it, not clearly. It's like my brain's trying to protect me from remembering. But sometimes it all comes back. The sound of gunfire, the smoke, the bodies. So many bodies." His voice cracked as he said the last part. LeBron's throat tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He let John take his time. John continued, his words tumbling out, raw and jagged. "You try to forget, but it doesn't work. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. And then, when I wake up, it's like I'm still there." John's eyes grew distant, unfocused. He didn't notice LeBron watching him closely. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of pain, of fear, that seemed almost impossible to fathom. It wasn't the kind of pain you could fix with a simple, "You'll be fine." It was something deeper, something ingrained into the very fabric of his soul. LeBron swallowed hard. "How long has it been?" "A lifetime," John replied softly, his voice barely a whisper. "But it feels like it was yesterday." LeBron didn't know what to say. He couldn't even begin to understand what John had gone through. But he also couldn't walk away, not now. "Tell me more," LeBron said quietly. "I'm here." Weeks passed, and each day, LeBron made it a point to visit John. The conversations were always slow at first, but each time, John opened up a little more. There were days when John didn't want to speak at all, his face closed off, his thoughts distant. But LeBron kept coming back. He brought food, water, and sometimes just his presence. It wasn't much, but it was something. And John began to expect him. LeBron learned more about John's life, about the war, his lost friends, the years he spent searching for something that was already gone. He learned about John's family, how they had turned their backs on him long ago. John told him once, "I don't even know if they're still alive. I haven't heard from them in I don't know how long. They didn't want me back, not after what I'd seen, what I became. They couldn't understand why I couldn't just get over it." His voice had shaken as he said those words, a tremor LeBron hadn't seen before. LeBron didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just sat there, listening, offering a quiet nod or a word of reassurance when it felt right. And John started to trust him, just a little bit at first, but it was enough. One day, LeBron brought a change of clothes. "You ever think about getting cleaned up?" he asked. John eyed the clothes warily, but he didn't refuse. "I've lost my way," he said, his voice low. "I don't think I even know who I am anymore." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," LeBron said. "But maybe today, just today, you can try something new." For the first time, John let a small smile tug at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark something between them, a quiet understanding. As the days turned into weeks, LeBron began bringing more help. He found local shelters and rehabilitation centers willing to offer John support, and though John hesitated, he eventually agreed to take the first step toward reconnecting with the world. But progress wasn't always linear. There were days when John slipped back into his old habits: isolation, anger, fear. He would shut down, pushing LeBron away, afraid of getting too close. But LeBron never gave up. He kept showing up, kept encouraging, kept listening. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, John began to reawaken. He started to paint again, the way he had before the war. At first, the paintings were dark, chaotic, a reflection of his inner turmoil. But over time, the colors began to shift. The images softened, became more vivid, more alive. LeBron watched it all, a quiet observer, knowing that John was healing in his own way, at his own pace. And for the first time, LeBron began to understand that healing didn't always mean fixing. Sometimes, it was just about being there. The sun had just set, casting long shadows over the quiet street, and LeBron had made his way to the corner again, where John was seated on the same piece of cardboard. This time, the air was cooler, the promise of night settling in with the first chill of autumn. LeBron had been bringing John small things, shoes, socks, a jacket, and he could see that John was slowly starting to care again. His face was a little cleaner, the wildness in his eyes subdued by time and patience. John wasn't talking much tonight. His head was bowed low, his hands clenched in his lap. LeBron sat beside him, just as he had before. He didn't push, just let the silence hang between them. He was beginning to realize that some days, the most important thing was simply showing up. Suddenly, John's body tensed, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His eyes snapped open, wide and panicked, his breath coming in rapid, shallow bursts. LeBron looked down at him, startled, as John muttered something incoherent, his voice low but urgent. "No! No, no, no!" John's voice cracked, and his body jerked violently, his arms flailing as if fighting invisible enemies. LeBron instinctively reached out, his hands trying to calm him. But John was far beyond reason, locked in a battle only he could see. "John!" LeBron said urgently, his hands firm on his shoulders. "John, it's okay, it's just a dream, you're safe." But John wasn't hearing him. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide, terrified, and the words spilling from his mouth were nonsensical. "Fire! I can't! No, not again, God, no, stop!" He was choking on his words, his face twisted in horror, his hands reaching out as if to ward off some invisible threat. LeBron's heart raced, but he didn't pull away. He wasn't about to leave him alone. He kept talking, kept trying to anchor him to the present, to the safety of the street corner. "John, listen to me. You're here. You're with me, okay? You're not there anymore." John's body stiffened again, and for a moment, LeBron thought he might fall unconscious. But then, as quickly as it started, the panic began to subside. John's breathing slowed, the tremors in his hands fading as his eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding his gaze. He blinked a few times, disoriented, sweat dripping down his forehead. LeBron kept his hand on John's shoulder, a reassuring presence, as John regained control of himself. "It's okay, man. You're all right," LeBron said, his voice soft but steady. "It's over." John wiped his face with the back of his hand, muttering under his breath, his voice trembling. "Sorry. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry." LeBron's expression softened. He didn't press for answers. Instead, he simply said, "You don't have to apologize. It's not your fault." He sat quietly, waiting for John to settle back into himself. After a long moment, John finally looked at LeBron, the fear still lingering in his eyes, but there was something else too. Something raw, something vulnerable. I can't escape it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll never escape it." LeBron stayed silent for a long time, simply letting John feel the weight of his words without interruption. Then, softly, he said, "You don't have to escape it alone." The following day, LeBron met John at a small cafe, a quiet place tucked away from the hustle of the city. It was something new, something that felt different. The cafe was warm, the air smelling of freshly ground coffee beans and baked pastries. LeBron watched as John hesitated at the door, as if the comfort of the cafe's interior was a world too far removed from his own. "Come on," LeBron said, offering a small smile. "I promise you'll be fine." John stepped inside, the bells on the door jingling softly as he did. He looked around, as if unsure of what to do. The world inside the cafe felt so normal, so bright, but John's shoulders were still hunched, like he was carrying the weight of a lifetime on his back. LeBron led him to a corner booth, and after a moment's hesitation, John slid into the seat. He still seemed out of place, like he didn't belong here, but LeBron could tell that something had shifted. He was trying. "So, what have you been doing lately?" LeBron asked, the question simple but open-ended. He wanted to know what was going on inside John's mind, what he was thinking, what he was feeling. John stirred his coffee, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know. Painting. I've been painting again. I used to do it before the war, before everything." His voice faltered at the end, as if the words themselves were too heavy to say out loud. LeBron raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Painting? I didn't know that." John shrugged, but the faintest smile tugged at his lips. "Yeah. I used to paint houses, before I enlisted. But painting, it's different. It's something I can control. Or at least I thought I could." LeBron leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "What do you paint?" John stared into his coffee, his fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "A lot of things. But mostly, what I remember. The colors don't always match the feeling, but it's the only way I know how to get it out." He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. "Sometimes I paint the war. The fire. The bodies. The blood." He shuddered slightly, his fingers tightening around the mug. "I never wanted it to be this way, but it is. And I can't stop." LeBron sat quietly, absorbing John's words, letting them sit in the air between them. "You don't have to stop," he said softly. "You just have to let yourself feel it. You don't have to hide it anymore." John looked up at LeBron then, his eyes meeting his for the first time in a while. The vulnerability was there, raw and unguarded. "You really think I can?" His voice was barely a whisper. LeBron smiled gently. "I think you can. And I think you don't have to do it alone. You've already started. You've come this far." John's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was enough for now. They sat together in the quiet cafe, two people from completely different worlds, both searching for something they couldn't quite define. But in that moment, there was a small sense of peace between them, a small step forward. And that, LeBron thought, was a good place to start. The weeks that followed felt different. The air seemed to hold more promise, and John's reluctant steps toward reclaiming his life began to show. LeBron had found a few local programs that helped veterans reintegrate into civilian life, and while John was hesitant at first, he had agreed to at least visit one. He never talked about it much afterward, but LeBron could see the difference in his eyes, the way his shoulders had slowly begun to relax, how the tension in his hands had lessened, even if only by a little. One chilly morning, as they sat on the steps of a community center, LeBron turned to John, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for the past few minutes. "You doing okay?" LeBron asked, his voice calm but genuine. John gave him a tight, fleeting smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here," he muttered, looking down at his hands. There was a softness to his voice, a weariness, as if the weight of what they'd been through together was just beginning to settle into his bones. "Just here." LeBron didn't respond right away, letting the words hang in the air. He had learned by now that John didn't always have to talk. Sometimes just sitting together was enough. But today, something felt different. The time had come to push him just a little further. "You know, you don't have to do this alone," LeBron said after a long pause. "I'm here. Always." John didn't look up, but LeBron noticed the slightest movement in his jaw, the tightening of his muscles. It was a subtle thing, but it wasn't lost on him. John let out a long breath. "I can't just walk into a room full of people like I'm one of them. I'm not. I've been gone too long." LeBron shook his head, his expression unshaken. "It's not about being like them. It's about taking one step forward. Just one. John sat in silence, his face still drawn, but something in his posture had softened. LeBron waited, understanding that it might take time, but it was time he was willing to give. After a few long moments, John looked up at him, his gaze uncertain but not hostile. You really think I can? LeBron nodded. I know you can. One step. Just one. The words seemed to settle into John's mind. He didn't respond immediately, but there was something in his eyes now, something close to hope, fragile but present. And for the first time in a long while, John stood up from the steps without hesitation. His movements were slower, but steady. LeBron smiled, watching as John took that first small step into the community center. There was no fanfare, no momentous declaration, just a quiet, understated victory. But it was a victory nonetheless. A month passed, and John continued to attend the community center's support group for veterans, though he rarely spoke. He listened, absorbed the stories of others who had struggled in ways similar to his own. He never felt entirely comfortable there, but LeBron's consistent presence in his life kept him grounded. One evening, LeBron was at home, unwinding after a long day, when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. LeBron, it's John. The words were rough, hurried, almost frantic. There was a tremor in John's voice, and it instantly made LeBron's chest tighten. I need you, man. I can't do this anymore. LeBron's heart dropped. Where are you? He asked, his voice steady but urgent. There was a pause, followed by a shaky sigh. I'm at the park. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't sleep, I can't think straight, I keep seeing it. All of it. LeBron didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. The cold night air hit him as soon as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to slow him down. He drove quickly, weaving through the streets, the urgency in John's voice still ringing in his ears. When he reached the park, he saw John sitting on a bench, his head bowed low, his hands trembling in his lap. LeBron approached quietly, but John didn't look up. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. LeBron sat down beside him, close but not too close. He didn't need to fill the silence with words. He could see the weight John was carrying, feel the terror that had surged through him just moments ago. John wasn't asking for answers. He wasn't looking for advice. He was just asking for someone to be there. I don't know what to do anymore, John said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't stop it. I can't forget it. LeBron didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer some empty platitude. Instead, he placed a hand on John's shoulder, firm, reassuring, and present. You don't have to forget it, John. But you don't have to carry it alone either. Not anymore. John turned to him then, his eyes glassy, filled with emotion that he couldn't express. For a long time, he said nothing. But LeBron could see the walls coming down, piece by piece, as the weight of John's pain began to settle into something more manageable. After a while, John spoke again, his voice hoarse but stronger than before. I'm scared, he admitted quietly, the words coming with an effort. Scared that if I don't get it together, I'll never be right again. LeBron nodded, his voice calm and steady. You don't have to be right. You just have to be you. And if that means taking one step at a time, then that's what we'll do. John exhaled, his breath slow, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. Not perfect, not fixed, but perhaps a little closer to peace. I don't know if I'll ever be whole again, John said, his voice low. LeBron's smile was soft but genuine. You don't have to be whole. You just have to be willing to keep going. That's all any of us can do. And in that moment, there was no grand epiphany, no instant fix. But the silence that settled between them was warm, full of understanding. It was the kind of silence that only came when two people, though broken in their own ways, found something to hold on to together. John leaned back on the bench, his posture more relaxed than it had been in weeks. He wasn't free of his past, but he had taken another step forward. And for that, LeBron was proud of him. Weeks passed since John had reached out to LeBron that night at the park. The winter months arrived, and with it came a sense of progress. John was still attending therapy sessions and support groups, though he remained quiet, absorbing more than he spoke. His paintings, too, had begun to shift. They still bore traces of chaos, but now, amidst the turmoil, there were touches of light, colors that seemed to fight through the darkness. But not everything was easy. One evening, as LeBron was heading home, he received another call from John. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the number. LeBron. John's voice crackled, distant and disoriented. I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't. LeBron's pulse quickened. What's going on? Where are you? There was a long pause. I'm at the old bar. John muttered, his voice growing more frantic. I don't know what happened. I thought I was okay, but it's all coming back. I can't breathe, LeBron. I can't. I'm coming. LeBron interrupted, already moving toward his car. He wasn't going to let him fall back. Not after everything they had fought through together. By the time LeBron reached the bar, the city streets were empty, the cold air biting at his face. He pushed through the door and scanned the dimly lit room. He found John sitting at the far end of the bar, his hands clenched around a glass, his eyes vacant. The bartender gave LeBron a quick, pitying glance before returning to his work. LeBron approached cautiously, sitting beside John without saying a word. The smell of alcohol hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't the booze that had taken hold of John. It was something darker, more suffocating. You okay? LeBron asked, his voice soft, though he could feel the tension mounting. John's gaze was distant, unfocused. I thought I could handle it, he muttered. But it came back. All of it. And I don't know if I can make it through again. LeBron's heart tightened. He had seen this before, the moment when everything seemed to collapse in on itself, when the progress made felt like it meant nothing in the face of overwhelming fear. John's hands trembled on the counter, and for a moment, LeBron said nothing, just watching him. You don't have to make it through alone, John, he said softly. This isn't about being strong. It's about taking the next step. But John shook his head. I don't know how. LeBron leaned in closer. One step at a time. You've made it this far. Don't give up now. John stared at his drink, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, he reached for his glass. I'm sorry. I don't think I can do this, he whispered. I'm too broken. LeBron didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of those words, the pain, the helplessness that John was letting spill out. Instead of trying to fix it, he simply reached out, his hand resting gently on John's shoulder. You don't have to be whole. You just have to keep going. John's chest heaved with a shaky breath, and for a moment, LeBron thought he might pull away. But he didn't. Instead, John simply nodded, his head dropping slightly. LeBron sat with him, silent but steadfast. Sometimes words weren't enough. Sometimes you just had to wait until the storm passed. And together they waited. Months passed, and the pace of change had slowed but remained steady. John's work at the community center had grown more consistent. Though he still struggled with his demons, he had found a sense of purpose in helping others. His paintings now hung on the walls of a local gallery, and the dark, overwhelming emotions that had once consumed them were now reflected in a more controlled, deliberate form. LeBron continued to support him, offering encouragement whenever it was needed. They talked less about the war and more about the future, about the small victories that John could now see. They talked about everything and nothing, the bond between them growing deeper with each passing day. One late afternoon, as they sat on the steps outside the community center, LeBron noticed something different in John's posture. His back was straighter, his hands no longer trembling. John wasn't completely healed, but he was no longer the same man who had first met LeBron on the corner of that street. I never thought I'd get here, John said quietly, looking out at the sunset that painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Some days I didn't think I'd even survive. I thought it was too late for me. LeBron smiled softly, watching the colors shift in the sky. It's never too late. You just have to keep going. And you did. You're here. John nodded slowly, a sense of calm washing over him. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it, to believe that he had made it through, that the past didn't have to define his future. Just then, LeBron's phone rang. It was a local veterans group calling to inform John that they had been able to find a small apartment for him to move into, a fresh start, away from the street corner where he had spent so many years. The news hit John like a wave, and for a moment, his face faltered. It wasn't just the excitement of a new beginning. It was the weight of the unknown, the fear of stepping into something completely different. LeBron placed a hand on his back. You're ready for this, he said gently. This is your chance to make it your own. You've earned it. John looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. I don't know if I can do this without you. LeBron smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. You're never alone, John. Not anymore. With that, they stood up together, ready for the next step. Not everything was fixed, not everything was easy, but there was hope now, a chance for a life that wasn't defined by the past. And together, they walked toward the future, step by step. The following week, John moved into his new apartment, a modest one-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. He hung up his paintings, pieces of his soul displayed on the walls, each brushstroke telling a story of survival and resilience. LeBron helped him get settled, bringing over boxes and making sure John had everything he needed. For the first time in years, John didn't feel like he was alone in the world. He had a place to call his own, a place where he could breathe and, most importantly, heal. As they sat together on the couch, LeBron turned to him. You ready for this? John smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, something that hadn't been there for so long. Yeah. I think I am. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, John didn't feel broken. He didn't feel like the weight of his past was too much to carry. There was a future ahead, one that he hadn't dared to dream of for years, and it was within his reach. LeBron stood up to leave, and John followed him to the door. Before he left, he turned to John. I'm proud of you, man. John nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. LeBron smiled, giving him a final clap on the shoulder. You did it. You just needed someone to remind you of that. And as LeBron stepped out of the door, leaving John standing in his new apartment, a sense of quiet peace filled the space between them. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was a new beginning. John closed the door behind him, taking a deep breath, feeling for the first time in years like he might just be okay. And that was enough.